Part 2 of our second-year anniversary show, Straight Shooting News, Episode 12 of The Awakening, The BRICS Deception. A U.S. form of constitutional freedom survived the onslaught of authoritarian nationalism. And Part 2 will expose what is actually happening and taking place by showing you some history and some cautions. So when you hear these people act like they had no idea what was going to happen, no result, because they will be, because when things start affecting more and more Americans, and they're starting to, we break out into a world war. Like Trump told us in the interview we covered in the first part, they're going to come up with every excuse in the book. I said, well, there's mistakes. There's not mistakes, and we're going to show you why. This is why you need to be aware of this. You need to confront it. You've got to understand the importance of the petrodollar and the lies of climate change and to what extent these people will go to brainwash the children and even children as their props to get you to buy into it.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. The effect of this action, in other words, will be to stabilize the dollar.
In 1945, the US President Franklin Roosevelt made an agreement of the century with the Saudi king, whereby the US guaranteed the security of Saudi Arabia, and in exchange, the Saudi king agreed to sell oil in US dollars.
Saudi Arabia is in discussions with China to price some of its oil sales in yuan.
Most international oil sales are priced in US dollars regardless of the countries that are participating in the transaction. In 2020, for example, Saudi Arabia sold about $8.2 billion in oil to China and about $3.1 billion worth of oil to India. But rather than selling its oil in the rial, the national currency of Saudi Arabia, or in Chinese renminbi or Indian rupees, all of the transactions took place in US dollars.
How dare you! You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you!
Reports now in Europe where kids are getting anti-anxiety medication. They believe they're going to die. She is the Greta effect. She's causing and instilling fear in millions of kids around the world.
To an extraordinary child abuse. She is not the Messiah. She is just a depressed, an extremely anxious girl, and a very unhappy one. Her own parents, and Greta herself, have talked of her battle with depression and her chronic anxiety. And they talk of how Greta was so anxious that she couldn't even go to school. And she seems chronically attracted to apocalyptic visions, chronically attracted to fear.
I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act.
That is why it is child abuse to feed such a child crazy, threatening visions that global warming is going to wipe her out, wipe out the planet. Thinks her life has been destroyed, and she just can't handle that fear. I have such contempt for all the adults who made this girl cry with their global warming lies. To tell bizarre untruths.
Nature is angry, and we fool ourselves if we think we can fool nature, because nature always strikes back, and around the world nature is striking back with fury. In May, I went to the island nation of Tuvalu, where I witnessed an entire country fighting for its very existence against the rising seas.
Lies, lies, and lies. An Auckland University study of Tuvalu found that over the past 4 decades, 3/4 of Tuvalu's islands actually grew. The total land area increased 3% nearly. And around the Pacific is exactly the same story. 43% of islands growing, another 43% of them stable.
Mexico, the second largest economy in South America after Brazil, has considered a possible partnership with the BRICS countries, being an important country for the group in several aspects. Mexico is a strategic partner for these countries as it is geographically close to the United States and has a strong economic relationship with its neighbor to the north. In addition, Mexico is a member of the Pacific Alliance, which is a regional trade agreement that includes Chile, Colombia, and Peru. Aligns with the goals of BRICS countries, which have called for a more balanced global governance system that reflects the interests of developing countries. Mexico also has significant natural resources, a strong manufacturing sector, and a growing middle class, making it an attractive market for the BRICS countries. China is Mexico's largest trading partner among the BRICS. Technologies in agriculture and rural development. Mexico and Russia signed an agreement in 2019 to strengthen cooperation in the fields of energy, mining, and aerospace. However, Mexico faces several challenges in joining the BRICS. The group was formed in 2006 as an economic bloc with the goal of challenging the dominance of the Western countries in the global economy. While Mexico shares some similarities with the BRICS in terms of economic size and potential, it is not a part of the group's original vision. Moreover, the BRICS countries have different political systems, cultural backgrounds, and economic priorities, which could make it difficult for Mexico to find a common ground with them.
First question is over here.
Yes, I'd like to direct my question to Mr. Perot. What will you do as president to open foreign markets to fair competition from American business and here at home from foreign countries so that we can bring jobs back to the United States?
That's right at the top of my agenda. We've shipped millions of jobs overseas, and we have a strange situation because we have a process in Washington where after you've served for a while, you cash in, become a foreign lobbyist, make $30,000 a month, then take a leave, work on presidential campaigns, make sure you got good contacts, and then go back out. Now, if you just want to get down to brass tacks, first thing you ought to do is get all these folks who've got these one-way trade agreements that we've negotiated over the years and say, fellas, we'll take the same deal we gave you. And they'll gridlock right at that point because, for example, we've got international competitors who simply could not unload their cars off the ships if they had to comply. You see, if it was a two-way street, just couldn't do it. We have got to stop sending jobs overseas. To those of you in the audience who are business people, pretty simple. If you're paying $12, $13, $14 an hour for factory workers, and you can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for labor, hire a young 25, that's assuming you've been in business for a long time, you've got a mature workforce. Pay $1 an hour for your labor, have no health care, that's the most expensive single element making a car, have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south. So if the people send me to Washington, the first thing I'll do is study that 2,000-page agreement and make sure it's a two-way street. One last point here. I decided I was dumb and didn't understand it, so I called the who's who of the folks who've been around it. And I said, why won't everybody go south? They said, we'll be disruptive. I said, for how long? I finally got them up for 12 to 15 years. And I said, well, how does it stop being disruptive? And that is when their jobs come up from $1 an hour to $6 an hour and ours go down to $6 an hour, then it's leveled again. But in the meantime, you've wrecked the country with these kinds of deals. We got to cut it out.
Let's put all that in perspective for you. There's a reason why we played the clip from the Bush-Clinton debate. If you notice too, in those debates, they let the candidates finish their thoughts. Unlike today, where they buzz them out, say, time's up. All right. Now, To put it all in perspective, at the outset of the 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed financially under the communism. Reagan's financial advisors discovered the Soviet Union was surviving because of their investments in the West. And cut them off. It's ironic how for several decades, Western investors were propping up our enemies, while costs of fighting the Cold War fell on the middle class. It also explained why when Kennedy wanted to exchange information, and his bad thing was actually about UFOs and some of the other files, because he wanted to enter into a joint space venture with the Soviet Union and have discussions with Nikita Khrushchev. The powers that be in the U.S. went into a panic. We all know what happened to JFK. But back to the 1990s. There's a rising power of communist China was recognized. That isn't in discussion today. And the media was proponents of NAFTA. But Perot understood what the consequences would be. But where the important point to remember is about that time period, is the economy of Chinese was just rising. And what was taking place was the people who were pushing for NAFTA and the reorganization of GATT, very important. You don't hear much about that. But they wanted these countries in agreement with the U.S., knowing, just like Ross Perot said, there would be a large sucking zone for jobs leaving the U.S. And the caution was that if the U.S. didn't make this trade deal, Communist China was going to make this trade deal with nations. But Communist China did not have the power and the financial ability back then like they do now with BRICS. And with the help of many U.S. former allies. Saying former because they will be if they do sign on to Chinese. Even before they became, a challenging military superpower, they were using leverage because they played the long game. They played this long game. And when people today say, well, we don't understand. Well, we're showing you what happened. I'm going to give you a little more Perot too, because he's going to tell you the results, what happened several years later, the effects of that large sucking sound, and how it wasn't advantageous for people of other nations. He'll use Mexico. Play this clip, and we'll get to a little bit more.
Follow the money. Let's go to the trade deficit. We've got another ticking bomb in the trade deficit. We have the largest trade deficit in the history of the world. Now, you don't hear that. All you hear is the glory of free trade. Largest trade deficit in the history of the world. It was $165 billion in 94. It's projected to be $200 billion in 1995. In plain talk, last year we had $165 billion leave the country, and this year we're going to have about $200 billion go out of the U.S. because of our one-sided trade agreements. The trade deficit is like cancer. We're willing to treat colds, we're willing to treat minor problems, but we don't want to deal with the cancer. Each $1 billion in the trade deficit costs 20,000 jobs a year. The 220,000 jobs in the United States, the $200 billion trade deficit will cost us 4 million jobs. Just follow the money. Now let's go to NAFTA as a specific example. It was completely misrepresented to the American people. Mexico was presented as a role model for democracy and economic development. Go back during the NAFTA pitch. President Salinas was presented to the American people as George Washington II. The abuse of most of the people in Mexico by the Mexican elite was carefully covered up and ignored, even though it is as plain as the nose on your face if you go to Mexico and see how they force the Mexican workers to live. I want to make it very clear that I have enormous respect and affection for the people of Mexico. They are excellent people and excellent workers. I do not respect the way the people that control that country treat the Mexican worker. The Mexican economy and government were presented to the American people still as strong and stable and role models to the world as recently as the Economic Summit in Miami after the 94 elections and just a few days before the peso collapsed. The last big event, everybody was heralding it as a big success. Our White House, now keep in mind, to get NAFTA through, the Mexicans spent $50 million with lobbyists. That was in our major papers. Now the White House is participating in a $52 billion peso bailout, which our major newspapers have accurately described as a bailout for the elite in our financial community around the world and the wealthy people in Mexico. Keep in mind, $50 million for lobbying, $52 billion to bail out the peso, that's 1,000 to 1. Think about it. The cruelest part of the tragedy, and the one we should all focus on, is that at least 80 million wonderful, good, decent people in Mexico have been devastated by these events. They're losing their homes and everything else they've ever bought on credit as interest rates soar to over 100%. And some of these were conditions we imposed on Mexico as a condition for getting the bailout. The bailout didn't help the Mexican people. It bailed out the guys on Wall Street. They took the money and did not go back into Mexico, believe me. The money they took was in a currency stabilization fund. It had been invested in yen and Deutschmarks, two good currencies. We pulled it out, started investing in the peso, and the dollar fall has gone on. See, people don't tie things together. When did the dollar start falling? Why? The stabilization fund has been dedicated to the peso, not the dollar. That's what it's supposed to be for. Data available from the Mexican government will tell you the whole story. In 1989, the typical Mexican worker made a little over $9 a day, 1989. Now keep in mind, now we have George Washington II in office. Things are getting better, 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 better. And in 1994, before the peso crashed, that $9 a day had dropped to $3.13 a day. But nobody ever focused on that. Folks, people who don't make anything can't buy anything. You heard all these stories about Walmart and everybody going down there, and then in fine print they said they'd had to close them or they'd close most of the cash registers, etc., etc. People who don't make anything can't buy anything. After the peso devaluation, the $3.13 a day became $1.88 a day. A typical Mexican family now cannot afford to even buy food, much less products made in the USA. The money used to stabilize the peso accomplished little or nothing except to protect the investors at taxpayer expense. It's a pretty blunt one. The U.S. lied about Mexico's finances. I think it's not asking too much to have our people that we send up here as our elected servants tell us the truth, particularly on things as simple and direct as numbers. And now let's look at the NAFTA trade deficit alone. The trade deficit for 1995, now keep in mind this is going to be the savior of the world if we got NAFTA through, is forecasted for 1995 to be $20 billion. That's just what we need is another growing trade deficit. Follow the money. And now let's go to the U.S. dollar. For years, the term sound as a dollar was a trademark of the stability and strength of our currency. We just take for granted that the dollar will always be the world's reserve currency. We cannot assume this. We have to earn it. A 1930 $1 bill is worth about 10 cents today. In 1953, $1 would buy 360 Japanese yen. Today, it buys 83. That's a 77% drop. Middle Eastern oil countries use the dollar as the currency reserve. They're now openly expressing concern about the stability of the dollar. If they shift to another currency, the fluctuating cost of oil in this country can have a dramatic and adverse effect on our people and our economy. We must keep the dollar strong and stable in order for it to continue as the world's reserve currency. The weakness of the dollar is directly tied to our irresponsible runaway debt and mismanagement of our government. Some interesting points were made in a book that was printed in 1992. By the year 2000, foreigners will own approximately 20% of the U.S. gross national product. Foreign firms could account for 25% of U.S. manufacturing, production, and 45% of the U.S. banking sector. If you look at the numbers we've discussed today, why would we expect the world to have confidence in the dollar? Again, follow the numbers. Jobs. The magic of America is the fact that millions of people have had a good job that will allow them to support their families and have the world's highest standard of living. We can only balance our budget and pay our debt if we have a growing, expanding job base. We can only have this if millions of Americans are working at good-paying jobs. 2 million U.S. manufacturing jobs were moved to Asia alone. The people who had these jobs were making $440 a week. If they have a job at all today, they're making $270 a week. And I don't have to tell you the value of the dollar has gone down during that period. So they're making less dollars, and what they're getting is worth less money. On the other hand, our Congress gets a cost of living adjustment. Every time the dollar gets cheaper, they make more money. Helps you understand why there's no discipline on spending. But the people in this country do not. Never forget that millions of people who work in good-paying jobs are the heart of our tax base and the key to our being able to balance our budget and pay the $4.8 trillion. So if you want to come up with a plan to balance the budget and pay the debt, you want to see a growing, expanding job base. You can't tax people who aren't making money. I'll leave you with Thomas Jefferson's words. Here they are. My confidence in my countrymen leaves me without much fear for the future. And I'm sure we all agree with that. Our challenge is to make sure that every citizen is fully informed and casts an informed vote. And finally, these lines summarize everything I've said today. The budget should be balanced, the Treasury should be refilled, public debt should be reduced, the arrogance of public officials should be controlled. These are not my words. Cicero spoke these words 2,000 years ago. History does repeat itself.
History does repeat itself. But we don't even have to go as far back as Cicero right now. Let's just go back to, I believe that was from 1994, 1995. It appears Mr. Perot was talking about what we're seeing taking place today. What the mainstream media isn't talking about today is, first, the fact that NAFTA and GATT was designed to become fully implemented over the course of 15 years. It was a slow boil of the frog. And what happened 12 to 15 years later, as Perot predicted, we had a banking crash in 2007, 2008. And that was no accident. That was foreseen. Many of us knew it was going to come. Too many lopsided trade deficits, government bailouts. He spoke about how after Mexico got involved with NAFTA, their economy collapsed. Peso collapsed, the purchasing power. What's happening today, if you don't understand? The U.S. had to bail out Mexico to keep the illusion alive back then. And so we've been seeing bailouts take place in the U.S. Now we've had a banks ready to collapse today. Not just one, not just two, it's many holding on right now. So today we see it coming apart. And we also see our purchasing power of our dollar being collapsed. And Perot also told you about the World Trade Currency. Back then we were still talking about oil. But yeah, let's go back now. The banks that we're bailing out today are banks that are heavily invested by communist China and the drug cartels. Now, the proof of that is what we showed you in the Pandora Papers in the past several shows. Go back and watch them. And then you can watch this again, because you need to understand. Like I said, Jefferson gave us hope because he believed that the people would pay attention and be informed enough to protect their country, which means all their rights and their way of life. It's the Constitution. But remember, he just fought a war. How many wars are we going to have to fight to wake people up? So what we're hearing about coming from Mexico today, from the proponents of BRICS, they're telling us Mexico wants to become a partner in the BRICS financial. And who controls that? The Chinese won. Maybe because Mexico has now been put in a position where the U.S. can't help them. I mean, even back then, there was just lies and more lies about from the media. We're hearing them again today. So what Perot kept repeating over and over again was follow the money. As you're seeing, we're not getting the details from the media. We're not getting the details from the government on what is taking place today. And like you were saying, all these foreign investments in the U.S., how much of the U.S. is owned by foreign entities today and being operated by foreign nations? I mean, this is why we played this, because no one can say they didn't understand that this was going to happen. Yeah. Plausible deniability, we're way past that. So how's the U.S. tax base doing today? Where's our debt? If it was doing so well, why is the current administration raising taxes? Even after claiming how great of a job they're doing. That the communist Chinese leverage to force the U.S. into trade deals like NAFTA and reorganization of GATT, sent all these U.S. good jobs to Asia and other nations around the world. Yes, it did. It opened U.S. banks and manufacturers to foreign ownership and lower U.S. wages. Yes, it did. Most importantly, what took place in the 90s set up the takedown of the U.S. dollar as the world trading currency today. It made it vulnerable to under the control of the communist Chinese. That was being discussed as early as 2001. And BRICS was launched in 2005. I was following when it came up. What is this? So it's a major step into the plan to take down the U.S. Even our allies could not compete in low-wage earning nations. So, but what happened? What happened to stop the communist Chinese plan for global dominance by the authoritarian nationalism? Roll the next clip.
I'm the only guy that talks numbers. I love this. Nobody else will even talk about it. As I've said, it's like a crazy ant in the basement. Everybody knows she's there, but nobody talks about her. I'm talking about it. Then I can talk, with endless numbers about it. And then when I finish, typically the establishment press said, he didn't tell us enough.
This has been a good deal for both Canada and the United States. Both have gained jobs. Both have gained trade flows. Both have become more competitive in the world marketplace as a result.
And there is a tooth fairy and there is an Easter bunny. But the thing I want to make crystal clear to all of you, I've given 5 years of my life to this. I have worked night and day. And I do it for one reason, and that is concern for the future of this wonderful country. And I'm probably the most blessed man alive in this country because of my family and the parents I had and my children and my 10 wonderful grandchildren. And I just cannot, in good conscience, live with myself knowing and understanding what we're doing to the greatest country in the history of man.
It's my great honor to announce that we have successfully completed negotiations on a brand new deal to terminate and replace NAFTA and the NAFTA trade agreements with an incredible new U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement called USMCA. It sort of just works. MCA has a good ring to it. I have long contended that NAFTA was perhaps the worst trade deal ever made. Since NAFTA's adoption, the United States racked up trade deficits totaling more than $2 trillion. And it's a much higher number than that. With Canada and Mexico, it lost vast amounts of money and lost 4.1 million manufacturing jobs and 1 in 4 auto jobs. Lost about 25% of our auto jobs, even more than that. Throughout the campaign, I promised to renegotiate NAFTA, and today we have kept that promise. But for 25 years as a civilian, as a businessman, I used to say, how could anybody have signed a deal like NAFTA? And I watched New England and so many other places where I was, just the factories were leaving, the jobs were leaving, people were being fired, and we can't have that. So we have negotiated this new agreement based on the principle of fairness and reciprocity. To me, it's the most important word in trade, because we've been treated so unfairly by so many nations all over the world, and we're changing that. Without tariffs, you wouldn't be we wouldn't be standing here. I can tell you Bob and all of these folks would not be standing here right now. And we're totally prepared to do that if they don't negotiate. But Japan is wanting to negotiate. Actually, they called about 3 weeks ago, and he's a terrific man, just had a tremendous victory. And they said, we'd like to start negotiations immediately. India, which is the tariff king, they called us and they say, we want to start negotiations immediately. When Bob Lighthizer said, what happened? You would never do this. They said, no, we want to keep your president happy. Isn't that nice? Isn't that nice? It's true. They have to keep us happy because they understand that we're wise to what's been happening. India charges tariffs of 100%. And then if we want to put a tariff of 25% on, people will call from Congress. But that's not free trade. And I'd look back to people and say, where do these people come from? Where do they come from? So because of the power of tariffs and the power that we have with tariffs, we, in many cases, won't even have to use them. That's how powerful they are and how good they are.
Thank you, Mr. President. You have described India right now as a tariff king. Can you explain it a bit later?
Well, India charges us tremendous tariffs. When we send Harley Davidsons, motorcycles, other things to India, they charge very, very high tariffs. And I've spoken to Prime Minister Modi, and he's going to reduce them very substantially. Nobody ever spoke to these people. He said, nobody ever spoke to me. In other words, we've had leaders here. I'm not, trying to be overly dramatic. We've had presidents of the United States and trade representatives. They never spoke to India. Brazil's another one. That's a beauty. They charge us whatever they want.
So
if you ask some of the companies, they say Brazil is among the toughest in the world, maybe the toughest in the world. We don't call them and say, hey, you're treating our companies unfairly. You're treating our country unfairly. So India is a very, very high, they really charge tremendously high tariffs. There's a 100% tariff. Now that's so high that it's like a barrier. In other words, who's going to buy it? Costs you so much. Now they've already reduced that substantially, but it's still too high. My relationship with India is great, with Prime Minister Modi is great, and they're going to start doing a lot. They've called us to make a deal. We didn't even call them. They called us to make a deal, which is like shocking to people.
Let's take that apart. What do we see there? We saw two very wealthy, successful American businessmen putting their business interests aside because they understood what was happening to their country. That's where the Jefferson quote that Perot used comes into play. So now we're going to look at what's really going on here. What's going on in Mexico and with other nations around the world. What does BRICS have to do with its claim to be successors? What does it have to do with what Trump managed to do while he was president by invoking tariffs? It turned out these nations needed to trade with the U.S. He used the leverage of our markets against them. They had no choice. And as we saw, if you were following anyone saying what Trump derangement syndrome, when he went to these countries, he was very well welcomed. He got along with these nations that were originally signed into BRICS because they believed the U.S. dollar was going to be taken down. The communist Chinese would give them a better deal. We told you what the communist Chinese ploy is. They're not to coexist. They use wealth and monetary systems to gain control. They cannot coexist with any free market situation. That's why when people like Trump said, well, that's not free market economy. Well, you have to fight on a playing field that you're up against. If you're not being treated fairly, you can't sit there and say, well, we're going to do it this way. No, they'll eat you alive. But let's go on. Let's watch this next segment.
Your idea, and you've talked about 25 million jobs created, 4%
over a 10-year period
growth, is unrealistic. And they say, you talk a lot about growing the energy industry. They say with oil prices as low as they are right now, that's unrealistic as well. Your response?
So I just left some high representatives of India. They're growing at 8%. China is growing at 7%, and that for them is a catastrophically low number. We are growing. Our last report came out, and it's right around the 1% level, and I think it's going down. Last week, as you know, at the end of last week, they came out with an anemic jobs report, a terrible jobs report. In fact, I said, is that the last jobs report before the election? Because if it is, I should win easily. It was so bad.
Agreeing to overhaul NAFTA yesterday, calling the New Deal the U.S.-Mexico trade agreement.
Fair to say that you think China's the real issue here, that if we could make some sort of agreement with Canada, with Mexico, perhaps with the EU, we could then really focus on China?
Clearly, China's the issue, an important trading partner who will tilt the playing field towards themselves to get all the advantage for China to the detriment of our economy and our workers. Clearly, that is where our focus needs to be.
And what kind of a tough line do you think we should be taking with China? The line that the administration has laid out? Are there issues that you'd like to see front and center? Does that come down to opening markets? Does it come to protecting IP?
Well, sometimes we hurt ourselves. I just had a bill I introduced that the administration is implementing by executive order. As it turns out, the way our postal system works, it was cheaper to send something from Shanghai to Shreveport, Louisiana, than to send it from Baton Rouge to Shreveport, Louisiana. And that was because of postal policies governed by a UN treaty. That's gone now. That's a good thing that's gone. We're encouraging companies to set up in Shanghai instead of encouraging them to set up in Shreveport or any other city in the United States. So we need to see how we're hurting ourselves as well. I'm pleased to say our efforts on that have come to fruition.
I mean, those types of issues aside, which of course seems like a bit of a market inefficiency that might get solved, what should be the substance of any potential agreement with China at this point? Because on the one hand, you have a president who seems very fixated on the goods-based trade deficit. On the other, business people, a lot of people who have looked at this scene for a while say it's really about intellectual property policies and technology transfer and kind of big structural things that maybe are going to take a long time to have any impact on the trade flow.
I think all that is an issue, but the fact is that China will bend every WTO regulation to their advantage. And that is to the disadvantage of our workers, including taking goods produced, subsidized goods, and sending them to third countries in an effort to evade direct tariffs against China. Now, that is wrong. And clearly the president has to have a tough line.
People telling you, Trump, you can't do that, you can't do this. Well, he did it. So what was Trump actually doing to the communist Chinese economy and BRICS? I was building up our oil supplies and becoming energy independent to the point of dominance. President Trump knew this. He directly took on the nations of BRICS, Brazil, India, communist China, and South Africa. The driving force of renegotiating these trade agreements. Tax reductions, U.S. energy production. And he totally rejected these organizations like the UN. I mean, we had to play that segment about sending a letter. UN regulations. I mean, that was ridiculous. The WTO, when they tried to challenge the U.S. under Trump, WTO lost. So, what is the first thing that Biden did when he gets into office? So in part 3, we're going to show you what Biden policies have done and the position the U.S. is in now and what we have to do to reverse the damage. We may have to look back to history, to the future. Remember what Ross Perot said about history by quoting Jefferson, who quoted Cicero. This is why if it sounds like this, you're going to be overwhelmed with this. No. Jefferson had faith in the American people. That's why we keep telling you, stay the course, remain vigilant, and be positive. We can handle this. I'm going to show you how in our next segment.